Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we discuss leading political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. China has accused the United States of violating their recent trade deal, a move that threatens to derail fragile diplomatic progress and casts doubt on the likelihood of an imminent call between leaders Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. On Monday, yesterday, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce issued a strong rebuke of Trump's claim that Beijing had breached the consensus reached in Geneva last month. The ministry accused Washington of introducing new discriminatory restrictions, including tighter export controls on AI chips, software, and jet engine components, alongside revoking Chinese student visas. Quote, "If the US insists on its own way and continues to damage China's interests, China will take resolute and forceful measures to safeguard its legitimate rights and interests," end quote, the ministry warned. It maintained that Beijing has, quote, "strictly and sincerely," end quote, honored the consensus, last reaffirmed during Trump and Xi's January 17th call. As we have seen, however, there has been some concern that China has been slow to remove the restrictions it imposed on rare earth mineral exports to the US and others. The fallout rattled financial markets, with Asian stocks falling. A gauge of Chinese shares traded in Hong Kong dropped as much as 2.9%, the steepest fall in nearly 2 months. The renewed trade tensions follow Washington's recent moves to impose further technology export restrictions and bar the sale of key components to China, part of the ongoing US-China technology war, which we've been following closely on China Update. Beyond economic friction, geopolitical tensions are also mounting. Over the weekend, China's foreign ministry condemned US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's assertion that Beijing poses an imminent threat to Taiwan, further straining ties. Despite Trump's public hope for a call with Xi this week, no date has been set. The president has floated the idea of visiting China to break the deadlock, but has yet to confirm any such trip. Meanwhile, US Trade Representative Jamison Greer criticized Beijing for not expediting exports of critical minerals essential to high-tech manufacturing. Meanwhile, China is increasingly fighting a multi-front trade war. The European Union has taken a decisive step to restrict imports of Chinese medical devices in response to Beijing's alleged discriminatory practices against foreign manufacturers. In a move that escalates trade tensions between two of the world's largest economies, or at least economic blocs, EU member states have voted to bar Chinese bidders from public contracts exceeding €5 million for the next 5 years. The EU's decision stems from an investigation earlier this year, which found that 87% of Chinese hospital procurement contracts contained, quote, direct or indirect discrimination, end quote, effectively favouring domestic suppliers over foreign ones. Brussels highlighted that China's Made in China policy aggressively promotes domestic production and sets targets for hospitals to source up to 95% of medical devices locally by 2030. This marks the EU's first use of its 2022 International Procurement Instrument, IPI, aimed at compelling foreign governments to open their public procurement markets to European firms. According to Eurostat, the EU imported €5.2 billion worth of Chinese medical devices in 2024, from MRI scanners to syringes. The China Chamber of Commerce to the EU criticized the measure as a, quote, unilateral instrument, end quote. However, the EU Trade Commissioner expressed willingness to negotiate with Beijing, with talks set for Tuesday today with Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao at the OECD meeting in Paris. The move comes amid a broader EU strategy to de-risk from China, including recent tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and multiple anti-dumping investigations, while China has retaliated with trade measures of its own. Next up, we move to the Chinese economy, and unfortunately, the bad news for China does not end with the trade war. China's manufacturing sector experienced its sharpest decline since September 2022, during the worst days of the zero-COVID lockdowns, as smaller exporters faced mounting pressure from higher US tariffs despite a temporary truce in the trade war. The Caixin Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, PMI, dropped to 48.3 in May from 50.4 in April, falling well below the 50 mark that distinguishes expansion from contraction. The reading, released by Caixin and S&P Global, missed every forecast in a Reuters survey, where the median estimate was 50.7. According to Wang Zhe, senior economist at Caixin Insight Group, both manufacturing supply and demand weakened, weighed down by a sharp decline in overseas demand. Quote, "The downward pressure on the economy has significantly intensified compared to preceding periods," end quote, Wang said. The Caixin PMI, which surveys smaller export-oriented firms, contrasts with the official PMI released by China's National Bureau of Statistics, which showed a more mild contraction. The divergence reflects how the trade war's brunt has fallen on small and medium-sized companies, while larger corporations with more diversified operations and, frankly, more protection from the state have fared relatively better. Becky Liu, head of China macro strategy at Standard Chartered Bank, noted that US tariffs have primarily hurt smaller exporters, which has led to reduced employment. Expressing, quote, "The additional slowdown in the global economy due to policy uncertainties in the US on top of trade policies will likely lead to some further weakness in small and medium enterprises' exports ahead," end quote. Despite these challenges, the survey also highlighted a modest improvement in sentiment towards future output, even as new orders and manufacturing output dropped, and companies cut purchasing and staffing levels. With rising trade tensions and sluggish domestic demand, the manufacturing outlook remains uncertain. As Raymond Young, chief economist for Greater China at ANZ Bank, put it, quote, "The trade environment remains highly uncertain. The key remains on property, which is still sluggish, with no sign of recovery," end quote. Next up, we have one more economic update to cover. If you want to continue being on top of the most up-to-date analysis on China as it moves into this new period of uncertainty and danger for the country, make sure you're subscribed to China Update, hit the bell notification icon, and you will be. And if you're getting some value from today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. And finally, for the economy, economists warn that China's deflationary pressures are likely to worsen this year, even as projections for the nation's economic growth and exports improve following a temporary trade truce with the US, which, as we have seen, is on very shaky ground already. According to a recent US-based Bloomberg survey, consumer prices in China are expected to rise by just 0.3% in 2025, the lowest projection since polling began, and a downward revision from the 0.4% forecast in April. Inflation has remained below zero for the past 3 years, marking the longest streak of price declines in decades. Dennis Shen, economist at Scope Ratings, expressed in a recent note, quote, "Recent data such as industrial production and exports suggest a degree of economic resilience amid the tariff negotiations." We know that this observation was made before the recent PMI data, which we just covered. We continue with the quote, "Nevertheless, deflationary forces remain a core macroeconomic challenge," end quote. The IMF now forecasts that China's consumer inflation will average 0 this year, the lowest among nearly 200 countries it tracks. The deflationary spiral is driven by price wars, weak consumer demand, and a prolonged property slump that has eroded household and business confidence. High-profile examples include BYD Co. slashing prices on nearly a dozen of its EV and hybrid models by up to 34%, reflecting fierce competition and concerns of further discounting in the sector. Exports are now expected to grow by 1.1% this year, revising earlier projections of a contraction. However, this trade momentum may be temporary, and Beijing is expected to apply limited policy stimulus, with the People's Bank of China forecast to lower its main policy rate by just 10 basis points and cut the reserve requirement ratio by 50 basis points in the fourth quarter. Quote, "Economy-wide price weakness is becoming entrenched," end quote, noted Erica Tay, economist at Maybank Securities, adding, quote, "Weak price-setting abilities affect company profits, employment, and consumer spending. For consumption to thrive, prices are an issue that needs policy attention," end quote. As China faces its longest streak of falling prices since the 1960s, economists warn that without decisive domestic support, deflation could pull the country into economic abyss. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I will see you for another episode on Thursday.